Welcome. It's good to have you here to this conversation with Andrew McCabe, distinguished Duke alum. While I have you as a captive audience, I want to advertise a couple talks that are coming up. Tomorrow we have lunch with Robert Satloff, who's an expert on the Middle East, and he will help make sense of the Israeli elections, which are happening right now. And so by the time of the lunch, we will have results and we'll be interpreting them. That's tomorrow. Then next Monday, we've invited Karen Skinner, who is the head of policy planning for the State Department under Secretary Pompeo, and she will be speaking in the 5:30, 6 o'clock time frame about Trump's doctrine for the world. And then on Tuesday after that, the 16th, our last event of the evening of the year is Lisa Disbrow, who was acting Secretary of the Air Force and a distinguished career in the Defense Department. These are all opportunities available to you, and if you're hearing about it for the first time, then look on our website, the American Grand Strategy Program, and you can sign up and get emails. You also have a chance tonight after our conversation. There'll be mics to ask a question, but then after it's all over, you can go into the lobby and Mr. McCabe will be there to sign books if you want to. And he'll sign any book, but he's particularly interested in signing this book. And so I encourage you to avail yourself of that opportunity. But of course, you were smart enough to come and hear Andy McCabe. When we were setting this up, you remember we were talking about this a couple months ago when we settled on the state. We said, that's a risky date. The night after the what I call the Duke finals, the basketball finals, and we were speculating, would this be a wonderful event? Would everyone be hungover? Would there still be burnings in the middle of the yard? It didn't work out as we feared, and so I want to know, was that your fault too?
No.
Okay.
No, it was definitely not my fault. I had absolutely nothing to do with that.
Good. Well, we're going to be exploring all of these topics. Welcome back to Duke, and welcome to Jill, another Dookie as well, your wife. And in fact, let's begin there, because we're going to talk about your career in the FBI in a moment, but your story with Jill begins here on this campus.
That's right.
That's a very hopeful story for some of the people in the audience. Can you tell that part of your story?
Yeah, it was, Jill and I were brought together by our mutual quest for food at an off-campus party. So I think, bored out of our skulls, probably not knowing anyone else there, we both gravitated to the kitchen, where we made and split a sandwich of Wonder Bread and mustard.
Mine.
Yeah. So that's how it starts. All good relationships start with Wonder Bread and mustard, at least the one that I have.
I'm amazed she stuck with you.
I know. Okay. Believe me, it wasn't just the Wonder Bread and mustard that's challenged that in the last few years, but
she's a remarkable woman.
Greatest experience, greatest accomplishment at Duke was meeting my bride. So
that's wonderful. So
all true.
You did graduate, and then you went on to.
You say that as if it was somehow not.
I checked with the registrar just to make sure. And you went on to the law school at Wash U in St. Louis. And then you joined the FBI, and you rose through the ranks with an extraordinary career, where you always seemed to be in the center of the action, where the action was. And so I want to begin there. That's really the title of your talk, of your book, The Threat: How the FBI Protects America, particularly during the post 9/11 environment. So talk to us a little bit about the role of the FBI in the national security space. So we know of the FBI in straight law enforcement, but talk to us about the role of the FBI in national security and how domestic versus foreign threats to national security play.
Sure. So the FBI has always played a prominent role in national security and domestic intelligence issues in the United States, long before 9/11, and for many years in ways that we're not proud of. But of course, the attacks on September 11th, that was really the moment of change for the FBI in terms of how we understood our responsibility as an intelligence agency and how we understood our new and enduring top priority in the organization, which is to prevent an act of terrorism in the United States or against Americans anywhere. So we were speaking earlier today with some students, and I related that Director Mueller often tells a story about going to the White House to brief President Bush in the days immediately after the attacks. And he begins his briefing by, taking out the infamous link chart and walking through what we've discovered about the attackers in the previous 24 hours. And President Bush cuts him off and says, "That's great. You're doing a terrific FBI job on figuring out who's responsible for this, but I don't really care about that right now. I want to know what you're doing to stop the next one." And I think that really drove it home in a visceral way for Director Mueller, and that really set us on the course to the place we are now. As one of the country's major intelligence agencies, a member of as it's informally known in the community, of the Big Six intelligence agencies in the United States, and really developing into that role of collaborating across the intelligence community with our partners to arrive at collaborative strategies, maximizing the authorities and the capabilities that we each have uniquely to address a threat that challenges us as a nation.
So one of the criticisms of the FBI, and indeed of the intelligence community in the lead up to 9/11 was that it was too stovepiped, that the FBI was protecting information so as to be able to prosecute something in the law, that if it had been shared with other organizations, that they might have pieced together and prevented it. Talk about how the FBI shifted or balances between prosecution and law and prevention, deterrence, and preempting future attacks.
Yeah, so it's really interesting. In that first kind of shift post 9/11, we overcompensated in that direction of, hey, we have to meet our obligations and our responsibilities as an intelligence agency. So let's establish a network of collection over folks who are under investigation as being involved in terrorism in one way or the other, and let's just continue collecting, because we don't know what we don't know. And so collect. So in those early years, those early post 9/11 years, the emphasis had gone 180 degrees away from where we had been. What we learned as we got better at what we do and a little bit more mature and more confident in our role as the nation's kind of domestic force against terrorism was that we needed to rely on our innate strength of actually bringing cases, that a prosecution in an Article III court here in the United States was one of several possible ways to disrupt a terrorist attack or a terrorist planning activity. It wasn't always the right way. There would be cases in which cases that we approached differently. But as the domestic investigators, that was the thing that we needed to bring to the table and offer to our partners. And so as you're conducting that investigation of a CT subject, you have to be ready to execute that arrest if it's necessary to stop that person from doing what they intend to do.
And at that time, so this would be just in the lead up to and immediate aftermath, what was your role in the FBI?
So I was a criminal investigator doing Russian organized crime work in New York City during 9/11. I was also a member of our SWAT team, so I did some tactical work with the SWAT program. But in the immediate...
Literally kicking down doors and...
yeah.
Okay. That's not
Seems like a long time ago.
That
was great work to do. So I talk a little bit in the book about how on 9/11, we all, especially those of us on the SWAT team, figured, okay, we need to get together and be ready to roll, because any minute now, somebody's going to come in the door with, here's a list of suspects that we have paper for, and we're going to go out and arrest. And we waited, and that day never came. Certainly didn't come on 9/11 and didn't come very, very soon thereafter. So as a member of the team, I was detailed to do security outside of our command post, which is where I spent the next month. So that was kind of my immediate 9/11 experience. I then got kind of roped into an ad hoc effort that the New York office had to stand up to do clearance investigations on people who had been detained as being out of status, essentially out of immigration status. Because overnight on 9/11, the Justice Department guidelines on what we would do with individuals who didn't have legal immigration status changed immediately. So 2 investigators went out on a terrorism lead. Let's say we got a call at the command post. Somebody said, my neighbor, he comes and goes at odd hours, and he has people over who I don't know, and I think it's suspicious. Then we would send 2 investigators out to go knock on that neighbor's door and find out what was happening. And there may be nothing happening at all nefarious with that neighbor, but if in the course of talking to that neighbor had a friend over, we would ask for that friend's ID, and that friend would say, I don't have ID, I'm in the country illegally. That friend would get detained. And the Immigration and Naturalization Service, it was INS at that time, wouldn't actually deport anyone detained pursuant to the 9/11 investigation until the FBI told them that that person had nothing to do with terrorism. So somebody had to do those investigations.
I see. So it's almost a presumption of guilt, or at least you not considered innocent until you're proven innocent.
Yes.
Yeah. And if you uncovered something suspicious like eating Wonder Bread with mustard, then
there's nothing suspicious about a Wonder Bread and mustard sandwich. No, you have to put yourself in the mind of like law enforcement and intelligence officials in New York City in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. We had no idea if there was a network of operatives, of facilitators, a support network in the city that had, that might have been involved with that activity. So although these folks were detained for violating the immigration laws and deportation was the lawful remedy for what they had done, there was a great sense of not letting anyone get outside of our capabilities until we knew that they hadn't had anything to do with the events. An overreach, an overreaction, driven to some degree by fear and paranoia, some fair criticism, driven by a responsible approach to trying to figure out who had perpetuated this disaster we were all living through, also a fair criticism.
So you're implying that the pendulum may have swung too far in one direction. Has it swung back to the happy middle, or has it swung back too far in the other direction? I'm thinking now of the balance between security and liberty, privacy and security.
Well, we, as an organization, the FBI has certainly come a long way. I talk a little bit in the book about how we brought our traditional criminal approach to investigations to the counterterrorism fight after 9/11. And that approach I describe as muscling. It's basically, you give us a problem, we'll figure out every possibility, and we'll run down every single one of those leads, every call that comes in, no matter how bizarre or outlandish or unlikely, we will run every one of those leads down. It's kind of an old-fashioned detective gumshoe way of approaching a problem set. What we learned over the years of working a threat that continued to grow, to metastasize, to get more complicated, to be more diverse in its distribution around the globe, was that's just not possible. It's not a realistic way to manage risk with a limited pool of resources. And we evolved into a more targeted or strategic approach to evaluate and triage threats and really go from the known to the next known, rather than scooping everything up in one bucket and trying to sort it out as involved or uninvolved.
Does that same principle apply to the threat of terrorism itself, that it can't be reduced to zero, it can only be reduced to some tolerable level, and then what is a tolerable level of terrorism to live with?
Well, I think that's a great description for what we have. I can't answer the question for you of what is an acceptable level of risk. As an investigator, we learned a lot from our foreign colleagues. I had a colleague in the UK describe to me once, as they were investigating so many different plots and threat streams at the same time, we just said to him, like, how do you prioritize? And he looked at me and said, we whack the alligator closest to the canoe. I mean, there is a very different acceptance of risk there. We know that we have a lot of people who are suspicious and who are involved in probably bad activity, and we have to focus on those that we think are, really ready to go.
Another trade-off that the FBI has to make is between foreign threats and domestically brewed threats.
That's right.
And of course, after 9/11, the foreign threat concern spiked. But in recent years, we've seen concerns about domestic threats. How would you rate the balance, and has the FBI got it right today?
Well, it's a great question. I think like any threat activity, it's constantly shifting. There are certainly indicators that we've all seen that would lead you to believe that right-wing extremist domestic terrorist activity is on the rise. That is something that, although I am no longer a part of the FBI and can't speak to what they're doing today, I would be confident to say that I'm sure they are closely watching all of the intelligence that they have that would underpin such an assessment. The very kind of headline version comparison between domestic terrorism and international terrorism is really not particularly accurate. It's kind of an easy comparison to make. They're both acts of terrorism, and they're worked by the same folks within the FBI. But in fact, the legal framework around international terrorism provides tools and partnerships with foreign intelligence agencies and surveillance collection activity and classified capabilities that are completely inapplicable on the domestic terrorism side. So to say that, well, you have more people working IT and DT is not, it's not really a fair comparison. But nevertheless, the FBI spends a lot of time assessing threats and prioritizing where they think the biggest problems are at any given moment. There's a year-long cycle that the field offices and headquarters enter into, which is basically a long discussion about prioritizing those threats, and that's how resources are ultimately allocated. So they try to keep a very close kind of finger on the pulse.
Another change that's happened over the last 18 years or so is the evolution of technology. I mean, everyone is carrying around an FBI in their pocket that's spying on them even as we speak. But that's not how it's worked. Okay. It's uncanny what it knows about me, I will say that. But the technology has evolved dramatically. And when we hear reports about 5G that's going to be undergirded by Huawei, a Chinese firm, we get the sense that the U.S. may not be at the cutting edge of the technology. We might be facing threats from competitors that are at our level technologically. Yeah. So was that the case that the terrorists and the folks you were tracking, the FBI, became sophisticated users of technology, and was technology as much part of the problem as part of the solution?
Absolutely. So technology really becomes the common link between all the very different threats that the FBI works. So on the terrorism side, it's not so much that the terrorists are developing technology that we can't keep up with, but they are incredibly adept at using technology that's commercially available to conceal their activities. So to conceal recruiting activity and communications around operations, things like that. That's how the FBI ends up in these unenviable conflicts with private platforms and technology companies over issues like access to data and access to communications. So that's really the threat on the terrorism side, very similar to the threat on the criminal side. On the counterintelligence side, it's an entirely different ballgame. So there, you have accurately described the world we are now in. While we were formerly the leaders in the development of all that technology, our competition is catching up very quickly. And as that technology develops, like 5G, it opens up entirely new avenues of vulnerabilities. So ways in which our data and communications and R&D, technological development, all those things become vulnerable to be stolen through economic espionage and other activity. The challenge for us is that we are not just competing with Huawei. It's not just Apple versus Huawei or Verizon versus Huawei, whatever the comparison would be. It's Verizon versus Huawei with the entire might of the Chinese government behind it. So that's the state support to those entities that are developing technological solutions that makes them so incredibly competitive at this moment in time.
I wonder if it's even worse, it might even be worse than you say, because just last week, General Dunford, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, went to Silicon Valley essentially to plead with the leading companies there to partner more with the U.S. government.
Right.
And 50 years ago, AT&T partnered closely with FBI and intelligence. But today, Google and others, the workers there, say they don't want to partner with national security. Did you work that end of the problem when you were in the FBI?
I did, from the perspective of the aftermath of Snowden's activity.
Right.
So Snowden was really the kind of watershed moment for us, particularly on the intelligence side of the FBI and our other partners in the intel community.
Snowden, the contractor who leaked all the information about what NSA might be up to do.
That's correct.
Okay.
That's correct. Who stole all of our stuff and gave it to the Russians and the Chinese. A different way of phrasing, I get that, but that's my perspective. Overnight, those issues of cooperation with the government and collaboration with intelligence agencies became anathema for a variety of reasons. But I think the biggest driver was the tech companies saw an opportunity to kind of stand out in the market and kind of cloak themselves in the mantle of protecting privacy rather than partnering with intelligence agencies and the FBI in the way that many of them had done substantially for years. So in the pre-Snowden world, where we could sit down with a tech company and cooperate on a solution to a technical problem, in the post-Snowden world, we could only interact through compulsion. So it's serving court orders and subpoenas and national security letters and things like that. The environment changed overnight from what had been a very cooperative relationship to one that was really borderline hostile.
So the other thing that changed, if we imagine you standing watch outside the command post, that was a time of great fear, but also great unity in the country. It seemed like partisan differences temporarily were subsided and people were joined together. In the last 15 years, the partisan element of national security has risen, and we had bitter debates about enhanced interrogation, bitter debates about the Benghazi, the terrorist attack on our compound in Benghazi, and so on. And I know Benghazi was an issue that you worked, so talk a little bit about your role in the Benghazi and what it was like to be on the receiving end of those investigations.
Sure. So when our special mission facility was attacked in Benghazi, Libya, I was serving as the Assistant Director of Counterterrorism, so running the CT program in the FBI. We knew very early on that we were embarking on what would be a long, ugly slog of an investigation. This is more like, probably we thought Benghazi was more like Khobar Towers than anything else we had done lately. And, we still make strides in the Khobar Towers case even to this day. So these foreign attacks in hostile environments where we are, at least initially, unwelcome, are very hard to solve instantly. And unfortunately, the narrative around Benghazi changed almost instantly. That first weekend after the attack, with the infamous comments that were made by Susan Rice and other people associated with the administration, the focus shifted from understanding who was actually responsible and holding those people accountable to understanding who wrote the talking points and why were they written a certain way, and was this all being spun for political advantage or disadvantage. So it was really a very frustrating time to be involved in a case that was so important to us, and one in which we knew that we had to be prepared to buckle in for the long haul. What we were getting were demands, immediate demands for answers about things that were just slightly off where the focus probably should have been.
On the other hand, it was probably good preparation for what came later, because it brings us now to 2016. Sure. I want to get there, and as toxic as the environment may have felt in the Benghazi investigations, it somehow became more toxic in 2016. And there's two storylines that I want us to pursue. One is the storyline of the investigation of Secretary Clinton's use of email, her private server, et cetera. That's one thread from 16. And the other was the thread of Russian involvement in the election and potential interference in the election. And you had a story, and you had a role in both of those stories. So let's begin with the Clinton email investigation. What was your role in that story?
So the Clinton email investigation began in July of 2015, when a few weeks before the FBI actually opened the case in July, they received a referral from the State Department IG and the intelligence community IG, alleging that the secretary had used a private email server rather than the normal State Department systems, and that they thought there was this danger that classified material may have passed through that system. So that's what we call an 811 referral. It comes into the Bureau for the purpose of determining, was classified material mishandled, and if so, was it done intentionally, and should somebody be held criminally accountable for that? So that's how the FBI opened that case. I was not at headquarters at the time. I was still running our Washington field office. I had nothing to do with the initiation of the case. I actually didn't take a role in supervising it until February of 2016, when they'd already been at it for some time. And so I was there for kind of the critical interviews, those things that you do kind of towards the end of the investigation, when you already have a pretty good understanding of what the forensic analysis of the computers is telling you. And now it's more a matter of talking to the people involved to understand what were they thinking when they made those decisions, or they shared these emails or deleted those emails, that sort of thing. That is to get to the hardest part of any mishandling case, or many of the cases the FBI does, and that is to try to collect evidence of intent. Without clear evidence of intent, you can't sustain a criminal charge.
So many people who had worked in national security saw this and said, wow, if I did that, I'd be fired on the spot. Why is she not facing tougher consequences for what was a clear violation, at least of IT? That's at least how many people saw it. Right. Was that how it looked to you inside the FBI?
Sure, and I don't think that's not an inaccurate way to look at it. But the key to what you said was, if I did that, I'd be fired. And that's very different than, if I did that, I'd be prosecuted and put in jail. Mm-hmm. Typically, when we find government employees who have not complied with what the requirements of the security requirements of their email systems, or have poorly handled classified information or something like that, that's the result. People get disciplined at work, maybe they lose their clearance, maybe they lose their job over it. But it's a very different thing to try to be able to prove that that person intended to mishandle classified information in a way that would make them potentially guilty of a felony.
So the report that Director Comey described to the public in July, I guess.
July 5th.
Yeah. Was that basically the report that you had written or had a lead role in developing?
Right. So we knew for several weeks, I say we, I'm referring not just to the team of investigators that were reporting ultimately up to myself and Director Comey, but also the prosecutors in the Justice Department who were working very closely with us. So it was kind of a small team of agents and analysts on our side and career prosecutors at DOJ on the other. The prevailing opinion across that team was that although we had uncovered many, many thousands of emails and reconstructed emails that had been previously deleted, and we had reviewed all of that material to find out if there was anything classified in it. And there was, in fact, some classified material, not a lot compared to the volume of emails, but some classified material. We ultimately were unable to show evidence that the secretary or anyone around her had intended to transmit classified over an unclassified system. And so, you know, as you do with any case that you work, particularly one so intensely over a long period of time, as an investigator, you have a sense of what you have, what you've found so far, and what you have left to do. And eventually that, you know, when you just start out, you don't really have very much. You have an allegation or a suspicion, and you've got a lot of work to do. And as the investigation goes on, that balance tips. You develop an opinion that I really don't have the evidence I need here, and these are the things I need, these are the last few things I need to do to try to collect it. So it was not a surprise to us, as it may have been to the rest of the world on July 5th, that this is how we felt about the case.
But what was surprising and what managed to annoy everybody then, was
Yes.
that the team and really Director Comey annoyed those who thought she's getting off light,
Right.
and then annoyed her side by dumping a lot of negative evaluation of her after exonerating her, or at least after saying that she was not criminally liable.
Right.
So do you think Director Comey erred in the way he handled the release of that information?
Well, I do now, and let me be very careful about this. So, to be clear, I was a participant in those conversations and the decisions leading up to that announcement. And at that time, I agreed with Director Comey's assessment that in light of the immense public interest in the case, a case that was essentially public before it ever came to the FBI, a case that people had been, you know, bellowing about what were we finding and what would we conclude for months and months and months. He felt strongly, although the normal Justice Department procedure is to not discuss the details of a case when you don't intend to charge someone, there have been many exceptions to that policy over time when the public interest is as high as certainly as it was in this case. Director Comey also felt that the Justice Department, because of the way they had handled the case and things that had taken place, like the infamous meeting on the tarmac in the days before our announcement, the Justice Department didn't have the credibility on the issue to be able to announce that sort of result. So it felt like the American public deserved to hear it, and the Justice Department couldn't do it. So we stepped up to make that announcement in an independent way. With hindsight, I think we made a mistake. I think that we were overconfident in Director Comey's ability to communicate to people, to convince them of the good work that we had done and the validity of our conclusion. I think I think we all underestimated, and Director Comey underestimated the kind of toxicity, the divide in that environment that you referred to before, and the fact that folks were not going to people would see our conclusion through the lens of their own personal politics, no matter what we said. So I think we, in some ways, took on far too much risk to the organization and should have approached that decision, that announcement differently.
One of the lines of critique that emerged quickly was the belief that the FBI was going soft on Secretary Clinton because of political bias on the team. And that was a charge leveled directly against you, but also later on, as more was learned about investigators on the team who coincidentally happened to be having an affair, and in their exchange of texts, they would described their contempt for the Republican candidate, and so it looked to many people on the outside like, wait a second, these are folks covering for their own. Why is that perspective wrong, do you think?
Well, that perspective is wrong because, and just to be perfectly clear, I have the same confidence today in the work that team and we did on that case and the conclusion we drew as I did in July of 2016. The facts are what the facts are, and the evidence to prove intent was simply not there. I think it was the right result. I had the opportunity to go back and redo it now, which thank God I don't. I would think differently about how we announced that result. Mm-hmm. But nevertheless, at that moment, everything about that announcement and the conclusion we drew and the people involved in it becomes kind of grist for the political mill. So people can step back and say that, we took it easy on Secretary Clinton because of the, I don't know, long historic crazy left-leaning bias of the FBI. Put whatever false narrative you want to finish that sentence. It's just simply not true. Politics did not play a role in the conclusions that we drew and the recommendation we made on that case. It was unbelievably unfortunate, tragic, that the work that we did, and particularly the work that Lisa Page and Pete Strzok did on that case, came into such kind of a horrible focus through the revelation of their text messages. So you have two people who really dedicated themselves and their lives to serving this country and did it with honor, and then made horrible decisions in their personal lives, and decisions that unfortunately brought incredibly negative criticism on the organization. And that was, and again, shed a inaccurate but fitting light on the work that team had done. It was just an incredibly unfortunate and tragic situation. But I will say this about Pete and Lisa, and I worked with them both for a long time, and I never saw politics affect the work that they did. I was shocked to see those texts when I ultimately learned about them months later, but never saw that kind of sentiment influence the work they did. And I think that has now, of course, been validated by an independent investigation of the decisions we made in the case.
So you were, though, concerned about the reputation of the FBI.
Absolutely.
And this led you perhaps to what was the most painful part of your personal career, I would believe. And I'm referring now to the story in the Wall Street Journal that is still trying to discover bias, if there was, and discovered that McAuliffe had donated to your wife, Dr. McCabe's campaign, and so there's a big Clinton donor donating to the family of McCabe, who was investigating the Clinton service. Easy to connect those dots. You could see how the reporter connected those dots. And it was your response to that in that article that got you crosswise with the IG. So can you tell us what happened? And I understand that there may be legal limitations on what you can tell us, but tell us what you can tell us, and we'll fill in the rest.
All right, so here's what happened. So if I finish that sentence, a team of ninja-clad attorneys will descend from the ceiling and take me out of here with a hood over my head. I would love to be able to sit here and walk through with you conclusion after conclusion of that IG report, because I, as you would guess, deeply disagree with them all. And not just what they concluded, but the circumstances around the work product that they delivered and the process that I was subjected to. Unfortunately, I cannot discuss that because I am still entangled in some legal issues as a result of that report, and so I can't go into it in any substantial length. But let me just say one thing about Jill and her run. So Jill, my wife Jill, ran for state senate in Virginia in the summer of 2015. before I had returned to headquarters, and of course, long before I had anything to do with the Clinton email case. She did receive the support of the governor of our state, who at the time was Terry McAuliffe, and the party that he was the head of, which is all pretty normal for someone running for state office. She received about, of 5 races that he supported, hers was, I think, the 3rd, so right in the middle of the pack. What you would expect for somebody who's running for office in Northern Virginia, which is an expensive place. I spoke to ethics officials at the FBI before Jill made her decision to run. I talked about that decision with the director's chief of staff. The director weighed in on it. My boss, the deputy director at the time, weighed in on it. I followed the advice that I was given by ethics officials. And so while it is easy to connect the dots, as you said, which is what the author of that Wall Street Journal article did, sometimes connecting what appear to be logical dots that make sense together when you string them together in that way leads you to an absolutely false conclusion. Mm-hmm. And it's been incredibly damaging to me and to Jill and to our family and our reputation. And so that's been unfortunate. But so beware of connecting the dots when you're not quite sure that they line up in the way that they seem to line up.
Well, let me ask one more painful question related to this then, though. A man you deeply admire, Director Comey,
yes,
as I read it, seems to side more with the IG account of what happened than with you. Am I misreading Comey's stance? He's not a full-throated defender of you on this particular issue.
Yeah. Well, here's what I'll say about Director Comey. I liked working for Director Comey, and I think he was a good director of the FBI. I didn't always agree with him. We disagreed on some pretty big things, as people will do, right? That's what you want, that kind of give and take, and particularly among leaders of an organization. But I think he was the right director for the FBI. I think he did a good job. I was disappointed when I heard some of the things that Director Comey said after he left the FBI. But I don't let that disappointment change my assessment of the job that he did as director.
Okay, well, let me ask about a non-contentious issue, Russian interference in the election.
It's no softballs.
Yes. I know you were involved in the FBI's investigation of that in 2017, but did you get much involved in 2016 in the early FBI efforts to figure out what was going on?
Sure. So, I mean, really, we had been watching Russian malign cyber activity targeting all kinds of different places and institutions in government, outside of government, since really probably the fall of 2014. So it was a kind of a slow build over 2 years.
And one of the controversies that's out there, and I'm going to ask you to speak to that controversy, is what started the look at this issue. And one speculation is it was this dossier, the so-called Steele dossier, that was a lot of basically opposition research. Steele was an investigator, former MI6, with contacts in Russia, and he pulled together a report that was filled with lots of fanciful and then some very serious charges, and that it was this politically motivated, perhaps, dossier that was what triggered the FBI's opening up a file to investigate this. Is that correct? Is that how it started?
That is absolutely not correct.
Okay.
So, again, to put it in kind of recent historical context, we had been watching Russian cyber activity for quite some time. We saw that activity really peak during the months leading up to the election. The election takes place. Immediately after the election, President Obama tasks the intelligence community to pull together all the information we have at every level of classification, the most valued sources, technical sources, whatever we have, and deliver to him a comprehensive write-up on what the Russians had done targeting the election. So we did that with the document that became known as the Intelligence Community Assessment.
Right.
And that document concluded that, yes, in fact, the Russians had meddled in the election. They had done it to sow confusion and discord, which is their favorite thing in the whole world. They had done it to hurt Hillary Clinton's chances of being elected, and they had done it to help Donald Trump's chances of being elected.
And am I right that that was with high confidence? Each one of those assessments was, which in intelligence language means we don't have much doubt about this. We're sure this happened.
That's exactly right, and unanimous across the board. There were maybe one kind of hair splitting of high to medium confidence on sub issue, but that's neither here nor there. So that's where we all were mentally going into 2016, right? Then we see that activity. So just before that's delivered at the end of 2016. But as we're walking through the months leading up to election, we're watching all that activity, all the Russian cyber activity. We see the theft of the DNC emails. We see the leaking of Podesta's emails and Democratic emails on the eve of the convention. So we know that this took place. In July of 2016, knowing what the Russians are doing, understanding that they are doing it to meddle with the campaign, we then have a foreign policy advisor of the Trump campaign talks to a foreign partner and basically tells that foreign partner, yes, the Russians are helping us with negative information, or they're helping us in some respect. I won't quote him exactly. So now, knowing the Russians are doing this, and we have someone who's affiliated with the campaign who has indicated not just a knowledge of it, but a willingness to accept that sort of assistance, we have a reason to start investigating whether or not the campaign has actually colluding with or conspiring with a foreign actor, which is, of course, illegal in this country. So we sit down to figure out, how do we get at that issue? And the logical way to do it is to begin investigating, looking at those people who are clearly part of the campaign, who we know have historical associations with Russia or with Russian intelligence. And that's how the first 4 cases are opened. All of that takes place before we ever receive a copy of the Steele dossier. Mm-hmm. Steele dossier had no role. In fact, we didn't have it we weren't, I'll say, consciously aware of it until
How did you know that the campaign aide was talking to or bragging about this to others?
I don't want to walk through the specifics of how we knew that, but that information came to us in a very credible way.
So one of the distinctions that's often drawn at this moment is a distinction between a criminal investigation and a counterintelligence investigation.
Right.
And at this point, it strikes me as more of a counterintelligence investigation than a criminal investigation. Am I right about that? And why might that distinction matter?
You are right about that characterization. It started as a counterintelligence investigation and continued as one. The important thing, I think, for you folks to understand is how we open a case. So under the FBI's guidelines, which are given to us by the Attorney General. It's the Attorney General guidelines. They come to the FBI. They're turned into a different document because we have to have another acronym to put on things and claim them for ourselves. Essentially, the standard to open a full investigation, so the most robust investigation with the most techniques available to it and authorities, is when we have an articulable suspicion that a threat to national security exists or a federal crime has been committed. So in this case, we don't know if the campaign is in fact coordinating with the government of Russia, but we have a very good articulable reason to believe that might be the case. That is the threshold to start investigating. Doesn't mean anyone's guilty, doesn't mean anyone's going to jail, doesn't mean you're trying to help one candidate or hurt the other one. It means we've been given very reliable information that the campaign might be coordinating with our most significant foreign adversary.
When you say the campaign, at this point, so it's July, August 2016, at this point, it could just be low-level people in the campaign that the president might not have even met met once.
Of course.
And the campaigns attract these kinds of folks.
Of course.
Who are trying to boost their power and sound more important than they are. So is it possible that...
Well, and I'll say in the counterintelligence realm, it may be that you find out that that's the case. Like there's some person kind of off the reservation doing things they shouldn't be doing. And then you take that opportunity to sit down with the campaign at a higher level and warn them, like, you need to be...
Watch this guy,
or counsel him, or get rid of him. And by the way, here's what you should be looking for about, foreign influence.
Did it reach that point where you talked to the campaign at that level in that way?
Not yet. So there's a certain amount of investigation that you have to do first to understand what you have. At that point, when you initiate the case, all you have is that articulable suspicion that something might be happening.
So something big happened in November, and that is candidate Trump won.
That's right.
So this change, how does the fact that he wins change the FBI's conduct of this case? Because he's now your boss. Now you're investigating your boss to be.
It's not an everyday occurrence. It was not ground that any of us had been down before. And so we had a lot of, remember, at this point we have kind of what we refer to as like an umbrella case open on the campaign, but that's really focused on 4 individuals, not including the president. And so we had a lot of conversations about how we could continue doing this. At what point would we have collected enough intelligence or evidence about these people and their activities to be able to just start closing these cases and resolve for ourselves that there is not any national security threat here and we can move on. Many counterintelligence cases are resolved in exactly that way. Or at some point we'd have to take things higher. We also talked about whether or not the president was engaging in a series of conversations with Jim Comey. This is after he's inaugurated in January, of course, in which the director confirmed for him that at that time he personally was not under investigation. And even that was something we struggled with because we were investigating the campaign and he as the candidate is the head of the campaign. And so, were we being too cute by half in confirming for him that he was not under investigation? Ultimately, Director Comey determined that he wanted to share that information with him.
So when did you first meet President Trump face to face? And when you did you say, I'm married to Dr. Jill McCabe, I'm that guy?
No, I didn't have to say that at that point. I did not meet President Trump until May 9th, which was the night that Director Comey was fired. That was my first meeting. So
what is the FBI doing from inauguration day to May 9th when Director Comey was fired? Is the investigation accelerating? Is it languishing?
It's certainly not languishing. It's a high priority investigation. It is moving forward in the way that investigations, particularly on the counterintelligence side, do at first, which is you're collecting information. You may be requesting, information from telephone companies or account information, things like that. So there's legal process going back and forth. Things are a little bit slow at that phase. We had kind of ramped up things with one of those 4 cases, which was a case on General Mike Flynn, which really came into focus with the discovery of information that made it clear that Director Flynn General Flynn had conversations with the Russian ambassador, Sergei Kislyak, and I think everybody knows that story now. So that had kind of flamed up a bit in the end of December into the beginning and middle of January, and ultimately resolved with General Flynn's firing.
But the president has already noticed you before this point, and he's tweeted at you, or about you anyway. So talk a little bit about what that's like. you are technically subordinate and working for the president, whom, under the Constitution, the people voted him to be your boss, on the one hand. But
It's not just a that's actually the way it is.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. But you also have tremendous power yourself that is able to put his presidency at risk, and he's trashing you on Twitter. So the combination of those three must have been exquisite.
Not the word I would have chosen. It was incredibly hard. It was very challenging. When the president lashes out at you publicly on Twitter as a career government employee, I'm not a political appointee, I'm not a political person by nature, that is a kind of really a perspective-changing moment. But we didn't have, and I didn't have, the luxury of engaging in that. I was not going to open up a Twitter account and start lobbing, barbs back at the president of the United States. That is just not how people in the FBI react. And so it was incredibly frustrating to endure that sort of kind of public, those public attacks, particularly when they involve my wife and ultimately my family. But nevertheless, you just stay focused on the job that you have to do, and you get that job done, and you try not to worry about these things. You try to think like, this is just him, it's going to go away, and at the end of the day, I've got responsibilities and have sworn an oath that I'm going to follow through on every single day.
So Comey is fired, and then what comes next, I think, is what has annoyed the Trump team the most. So can you talk a little bit about what came after that?
Sure. So, and again, just to set the table, so we know the Russians have meddled in the election. Our concern becomes, was the campaign coordinating with them? We have investigations underway. We're trying to square that away. And then after he's inaugurated, the president has a number of really concerning interactions with the director, where he asks him for kind of the infamous pledge of personal loyalty. And then he comes right out and asks us to drop the investigation into Mike Flynn, which at that point, he and the rest of the White House, knows is a part of our ongoing investigation into Russia, which the world knows about because the director had revealed that in his congressional testimony. So we know the Russians meddled. We're concerned the campaign might have coordinated with them. Now the president is asking us to discontinue our investigation into Mike Flynn, which really causes us to kind of scratch our heads and think, why would a president, any president, not want us to get to the bottom of whether or not the people in his campaign were working with the foreign adversary? With those mounting concerns, the president then, when we don't drop the Mike Flynn case, the president fires Director Comey. And in the days that follow the firing, the president makes several very concerning statements. Statements like, I was thinking about Russia when I fired the director. Or,
this is to Lester Holt
that's
on
right.
NBC.
Or he tells the Russians, I fired the director, and that's relieved a lot of pressure from the investigation. So when you put all those circumstances together, as an investigator, you go back to your authority. You go back to those documents that define your responsibilities. When do you start an investigation? When do you not? When do you stay? When do you go? And as I said earlier, that standard is when you have articulable facts that indicate a threat to national security or a federal crime. Threat to national security exists, or a federal crime may have been committed. And so in that context, we've looked at all of these statements and actions by the president leading us up to that point when Director Comey is fired and he says all these things publicly. And it was undeniable to us that there could be a threat to national security posed by the president of the United States. That is not something that the FBI can continue to investigate. That is something that you need a special counsel to investigate. You need to bring in someone who has not been appointed by the president, someone who is independent, professional, someone whose ethics and professionalism and integrity are without question, And so we found that person in Director Mueller.
So the president believes that you played a key role in launching that special investigation, and would he be right then that this is something you thought was necessary and you helped make it happen?
He's absolutely right if he believes that. I approved the opening of that case. I did it with the knowledge of the Deputy Attorney General, Rod Rosenstein, and I immediately notified Congress that I had done it.
Okay, I'm going to ask my last question, and then we have some time for questions from the audience, and there'll be roving mics along the aisleways here and upstairs. So I want to fast forward to a couple weeks ago,
okay,
when Director Mueller hands in his report. The Attorney General reviews the report, and in a transmittal letter to the Congress concludes there was unable to establish collusion.
That's right.
And made no determination on obstruction of justice, which are the two main lines of inquiry. Mm-hmm. Does that mean that your concerns were overdrawn? Or put another way, has Mueller satisfied you that what you were worried about did not happen?
Well, there's a couple things to unpack there. That's kind of an oversimplification, I guess. So, am I satisfied? I expect to be satisfied when I get to see the report. And I should hope that all people think about it that way. So I think it's really important to remember that we don't know yet. We understand how Attorney General Barr has characterized what's in that 400-page report, but it will be, to understand, to draw your own conclusions about it, I think you have to do that only after you see the report. The fact, if you split those two things out, the fact that Director Mueller has supposedly concluded that he found no evidence of collusion, so he didn't find enough evidence to indicate the existence of a conspiracy at the level that you would need to bring some sort of, a federal charge. Does that mean we shouldn't have investigated it? Absolutely not. We don't start investigations driving at a conclusion. We don't consider investigations to have been a waste of time or unwarranted simply because they ended up in a place where you didn't expect them to end up. You start investigations because you have an obligation to do your job. And our job at that moment, when we have that articulable suspicion, is to conduct the investigation to ensure that we and the Justice Department, and maybe in some circumstances the world, will know if, in fact, that threat existed. And it's just as valuable to be able to say, no, it didn't.
Well, let me just ask, when we talked about the Comey report during the campaign about the server, you said in hindsight it was not a good thing to have so much of the internal dirty bits, aired, dirty laundry aired, because of the way it contributed to toxic atmosphere. Would that same logic not apply now? We don't want to see the contents of the report if we're satisfied that the executive summary says there was no collusion, then we don't need to see the underlying evidence?
Well, to be clear, my hindsight concerns about our decisions in July over the Clinton email case are, one, the Bureau should have probably stayed in its traditional role and allowed the Department of Justice to announce the result. And they allowed the Department of Justice to determine how deep or how many of those details and kind of dirty bits they were going to expose in the course of announcing the result. I think announcing the result and announcing why we had drawn the conclusion we did would have been essential. I think it probably just would have been better for the FBI if the department had done it. Would it have been accepted any better if DOJ had done it? I don't think so. I just would have avoided inflicting all that pain on the Bureau. And let's be honest, my job was to run and protect the Bureau. So, but now we're in a very similar situation. We're struggling with that same idea, like how much of the detail do you reveal about people who are not being charged? I'm glad I'm not the Attorney General. I don't have to decide that. I do think that there is a compelling public interest in understanding what the special counsel team found in one direction or the other. Now, how much of the granularity of people's identities and things like that do you reveal? That's a sensitivity that I think DOJ is best positioned to figure out. And to be, I know we're kind of flipping back and forth here, but the issue on obstruction is very different. So the case we opened on the president was predicated both on the possibility of a national security threat and the possibility that a federal crime, obstruction of justice, may have taken place. And as I have heard from the reporting and from the Attorney General's letter, Director Mueller has not drawn a conclusion on that, but presented substantial evidence around that issue. I think that's important for the American people to know and to understand as everybody makes their own evaluations about how they think the president is performing. That's what we get to do here in a democracy. And I think that's relevant, important information about not just any citizen, but the President of the United States. I think the stars are aligning in the direction of compelling public interest.
Okay, so are you the man with the mic? So here we go.
I can't see a thing.
It's over there to the right, stage right.
Hey, thank you very much for coming. So the basic question that I have is, does the president have too much power over the executive branch? The independence of the FBI is largely customary, and obviously if someone wants to violate those customs or wants to input loyalists at key positions, that power and that independence can come into question. And so if that's true, what can we do about that? Or what can be done about that?
So I don't think that generally the president's power is too all-encompassing over the executive branch. I mean, you remember, we all know that's how this place was built, right? We have 3 separate branches of government. That's his. So I think we accept that he has incredible authority to run the executive branch. I think most presidents, really all presidents, but for maybe this one and Nixon, have been very careful about exercising that authority in a way that could be perceived as undermining agencies whose independence is absolutely essential to the way they function and to the way they support our democracy. The first and foremost being the Department of Justice and the FBI. And that's why the FBI only has one political appointee in the entire organization. And that's why presidents have always been so careful about the way they interact with directors of the FBI. Whether or not we can kind of codify that, I doubt it. I don't know that that sort of limitation on executive authority would pass judicial muster. But I think it's just I think it's really comes down to leadership. I think it comes down to assessing when you step back and start thinking about who you're going to support in the next presidential election. These are the things that you need to think about. Maybe more so than any particular policy issue, but the substance and the character of the person and how they approach issues like that, I would argue, is pretty important.
Here?
In a recent article, Peter Baker of the New York Times wrote that in the aftermath of Watergate, and this sort of relates to your previous question, in the aftermath of Watergate, it's unthinkable that an American president would fire the FBI director whose agency was investigating him or his campaign in this case. Similarly, for the president to, in effect, fire the attorney general would be unthinkable. And then he contrasts the current situation, and in particular, I guess, the current results of the Mueller report, where there's no conspiracy and there's no conclusions regarding the obstruction of justice. First of all, do you agree with Mr. Baker that in the aftermath of Watergate, it is unthinkable for that to happen, for those double firings to occur? And any additional thoughts would be appreciated.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I mean, I certainly agree with the sentiment that you've referred, that Mr. Baker referred to in his article. It's been I'm running out of adjectives. It's shocking. It's unbelievable on any level, some of the things that we have seen happen in the last 2 years. And that comes back to that earlier question about the observance of norms. And those norms have been shattered one after another, in ways that I think are deeply damaging to our democracy. The thing that troubles me the most is that when you look at all of these steps, you could certainly draw the conclusion that this president doesn't either understand or respect our democracy in the way that we understand it. To consistently hold himself above the law, like that cuts against an absolute tenet of our society. Like we believe as people, that's why we came here and fought the Brits over it, right? We think that nobody should be above the law, that everybody should be susceptible to the law. So this idea that a president, and I know this is a theory that some folks have, that the president, because he's the head of the executive branch, he has the authority or the power to eliminate any criminal investigation he wants because he's the Attorney General's boss, and therefore he can order the eradication of investigation even of him. I think that's preposterous. And I think that when we start embracing ideas like that, or even just assuming, taking for granted these consistent shatterings of norms, we are undermining our own idea of democracy. And I don't care where you sit on the political spectrum. I don't care if you lean conservative or liberal or who you voted for. If you took any group of people across that spectrum and sat them down and said, does it matter to you that we live in a country that's based on principles of fairness, and justice, and equal protection of the law for all people? I think everyone would agree with that, no matter who you voted for in the last election. So it is a shocking and strange world that we live in right now. I have had a front row seat to some of those strange things, but I think it would help in that incredibly polarized conversation that we have about seemingly everything now. It would help to step back from that and think about those things that still, I hope, knit us together as Americans.
But there's that counter narrative that says, yeah, it's shocking that the FBI was investigating a political campaign, that that they were conducting FISA warrants on low-level campaign workers, et cetera, et cetera. There is a counter narrative that has just the same amount of shock and anger on the other side. I do worry that we may never reach that level of comity where we can ratchet it down. Maybe this next question will ratchet us down here. We'll see.
I was just curious as to how much of the toxic political attitude has leached into either the FBI, 11 intelligence agencies, the military, because President Scumbo has mentioned that the military, he's got the military, the police agencies, and Bikers for Trump on his side, so watch out.
Yeah, I don't know about that.
Has there been a politicization of law enforcement and intelligence, domestic intelligence?
Well, I can only speak for the FBI. And do FBI people have their own strong political feelings? Absolutely they do. And we saw a lot of that bubble up in the aftermath of our announcement in the Clinton case in July, right? We had people within our own organization who were so enraged by the result that they didn't like that they began speaking to the press, and it was a very kind of restless time. But I have to say that other than that, which was a pretty unique set of circumstances, politics don't really play a role in the work of the FBI. People don't come in and sit around and talk about or argue about or throw things at each other over politics. It's understood that our work is supposed to exist above politics. We would prefer that it not veer into politics at all. Sometimes, like 2016, we find ourselves investigating things that are deeply connected to politics, not because we're trying to help one side or help the other or hurt anybody, but because that's where the facts arise from. And where those facts are, that's what triggers our obligation to investigate. And that's how I would answer your counterpoint that you brought up earlier.
Good. Over here.
Good evening. Buenas noches. The only reason I speak as a greeting in Spanish is to give respect for all the atrocities going on at the Mexican border. As a disclaimer, I can be very tangential and convoluted, so I'm going to read my question.
As long as it's brief, that's great.
It's very brief. I respect your dedication and service more than I could convey at this moment, despite the fact the reason I brought my 16, 17, and 18-year-old children here is much more about the character you depicted after you were fired. The character traits you have consistently displayed has given me many teachable moments for my children. Therefore, my main question is, how do I continue to convey the importance of character during this period of time when there are so few people conveying exemplary character? On some levels, I feel that anything we do currently is more like a Band-Aid, and the real paradigm shift has to be with our children and the younger people in our community. How would you convey to me or advise me?
So how do you embody character, and how do you teach it to the next generation?
Well, I think that you're doing it already. You've obviously identified this period of time as one in which the character, the values, the core values that we bring to the decisions we make in our personal and professional lives every day is so important. And so drawing the attention of your children and the young people that you interact with to that is something that will pay dividends back to them and to this country forever. I've tried to do that with my own children as we've been navigating a very, very tough year. And you don't do that by glossing over it. You don't want to overwhelm them with details, but I never let them get surprised by anything. And I'm so proud of them. They have become incredibly resilient, strong, very politically aware young people, 15 and 17. So I think they'll be better equipped not to maybe make some of the mistakes that we see being made so often today. And I would say, just to finish up on that line, it's important to remember that we as a nation, and in fact the FBI as an organization, has been through some terrible times in the past. Times that have challenged how we've approached our mission, challenged our own trust, that sacred trust that we hold with the people of this country to protect them from harm and to uphold the Constitution. And we've pulled through those times and been better for it. And despite everything that's happened, it seems like everything that happens every day, I remain optimistic that that is where we will land after this period as well. I was born in 1968. I'm a essentially post-Watergate kid, 51, whatever. But anyway, the FBI that I know is the post-Church Commission, post-Watergate FBI that every one of you knows and expects and demands. And that is the FBI that I was privileged to serve. That's not the FBI that's been in existence for 109 years. We changed a lot. So I think that you've got to kind of put these current struggles in the right perspective and stay focused on those things that are meaningful to you and try to pass that on to the children around you, I think.
I can think of one other thing. You could perhaps have your children read a book like this that covers these issues. And if more of you buy this book, he can provide a more appealing dinner than Wonder Bread and mustard for your wife. And that's what we'll hope for. And please join me in thanking.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was great. Thank you.